Everyone, welcome to our next lecture in the series Competition Policy and Strategy. Today we're going to talk about horizontal and vertical cooperation. Recall that in the last lecture, H1, we have been talking about collusion, and now we're taking a broader perspective by talking about cooperation in general. What we're going to talk about first is horizontal cooperation, and then we're moving towards more of a vertical cooperation component. We will have also a chapter H3 where we talk about vertical cooperation in more detail. So, before we start, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and if you have questions, remarks, anything you want to discuss, please feel free to use the comment section below. Okay, horizontal and vertical cooperation, what is it? Well, last time we've been talking about collusion. This is 101.1 and it's basically illegal in the European Union. However, there are types of legal horizontal cooperations, and if you want to know more, we have to look at the guidelines provided by the European Commission. And if you want to find them, just Google 2011 C1101 and you will find these guidelines. So, in the European Union, how are horizontal corporations treated? Well, first you have to check whether these agreements are capable of affecting trade between member states, right? So you have to have the community component to it. And if this is the case, then you have to determine whether the pro-competitive effects that come along with the cooperation outweigh negative effects that also are associated to the cooperation. So we basically move towards Article 101.3, where we have also addressed that the benefits to the consumer basically outweigh the negative effects. And so the type of cooperation that we consider is beneficial from an economic standpoint. So in the guidelines there are 4 cumulative conditions that we have to check. The first condition is that we just have to specify whether the cooperation actually leads to efficiency effects, right? So if there are no efficiency gains, then it's pretty clear that the type of cooperation cannot be beneficial. And it also has to be the case that these efficiencies are tied to the cooperation. So they must be, they shouldn't be attainable through other means, right? Because otherwise we could use a milder mean to reach our goal. The third point is that consumers have to benefit, and the benefits of the consumer have to outweigh the negative effects, right? So this has to be a net benefit to consumers associated to the cooperation, which we have been talking about. The last point is in terms of competition, so the cooperation shouldn't imply that we completely eliminate competition in the market. So it has its separate component here. Okay, that was pretty abstract. What are examples of horizontal cooperation? Well, there's information exchanges, agreements on R&D, production and specialization agreements, purchasing agreements, commercialization, joint marketing activities, and agreements on standards. We will look at information exchange, R&D agreements, and purchasing agreements in this lecture in detail. The other 3 aspects we're only addressing briefly. In detail means that we are presenting a theory model here. So let us first talk about information exchange. What does it mean? Well, basically it means that competitors share data or information directly or indirectly. Indirectly means that they use a trade association or a market research organization as a sort of channel through exchange information. There are potential efficiency gains here. We can reduce information asymmetries. For instance, if insurance companies share information on their insured. We can have benchmarking, so if like several firms produce a similar product or a similar set of products, then these firms might learn from one another how to improve production. That could lead to lower production costs, which in the end would be beneficial. Then we could have advantages in inventory management. For instance, if one firm is aware that demand for a certain product is increasing, then the other firms could stock up on these products so that the consumers have things that they can purchase the amount of products they want, so they don't have to wait for it too long. And by the same token, we could have reductions in consumer search or improvement in consumer choice. By the same means, for instance, there's a trend that's coming up and the firms share that trend, so it could be that this is beneficial because the firms produce or supply these respective products that the consumers want. However, there are detrimental effects associated to information exchanges. Well, the first one is pretty clear, that we could facilitate collusion. How do we facilitate collusion? Well, the argument is that it reduces the uncertainty, the strategic uncertainty associated to the competitor. So what this actually means against the current literature is relatively unclear. There's a recent paper of Joe Harrington in IJO where he pinpoints that. So we basically don't really know for sure right now against economic theory what this actually means, reducing strategic uncertainty. So what we have in practice is that this depends on the characteristics of the market and of the type of information that we share. For instance, if you share information about pricing 20 years ago, this probably has little strategic value for the competitor, or has little impact on competition. But if you share future pricing intentions, then that could look differently, right? So that's just, it still depends on the market, but that could be something that is worth to analyze in a real world case. And the other thing is that it could actually be the object of the information sharing to actually be a cartel agreement, right? And then it would be problematic as well. Okay, so how do we assess an information exchange? We start by looking at a model that is presented in the textbook of Tirol, where we have differentiated goods and the two firms compete à la Bertrand, and each firm offers its own variant. The demand for each variant is given by this function here. So it's basically a linear function where the demand for a variant I decreases in the price of the variant and increases in the price of the other variant. And we have that the increase or the decrease in the price of the own variant weighs more strongly than the increase in demand that is associated to an increase in the price of the other variant. That is something that we have been discussing when we talked about horizontal mergers. The thing here is that we introduce uncertainty about marginal cost. So what we have is the two firms are asymmetric in their marginal costs. One firm has marginal cost C2, and this is common knowledge, right? So common knowledge means firm 1 and firm 2 know these value. And the marginal costs of firm 1 are private information. That means firm 1 knows its own cost, but firm 2 does not. Firm 2 only knows that it could be either high or low. When firm 1's marginal costs are low, then we have C1 equals CL. When they are high, we have C1 equals CH. Sorry, there's a mistake here. That should be C1. If we are in such a setup, we have uncertainty and we have to formulate some sort of beliefs for the other firm. So firm 2 believes that firm 1 has a low cost with a probability y. And since we only have two types, the probability that the costs are high is 1 minus y. So for instance, if y is 0.3, then firm 2 would believe that firm 1 has low cost with 30% probability and high cost with 70% probability, right? And based on this, we could formulate expected costs, expected marginal costs that firm 2 expects firm 1 to have. And this could be formulated like this, so y times CL plus 1 minus y times CH. So it's basically a weighted average of the marginal cost here based on the beliefs of firm 2. We have both firms being risk neutral, which is realistic in a firm setup, and it also makes the analysis more easy because We don't have to think about risk premium or anything. We define P1L and P1H to be the price for when firm 1 has low cost and high cost respectively. So again, this should be C1. Sorry for the typo. Okay, so that's the standard setup that we're looking at here. Okay, so how do we solve that problem? First, we look at firm 1's maximization, profit maximization. So what does firm 1 do? Firm 1 has no uncertainty, so firm 2 knows that firm 1 has no uncertainty, so it expects firm 1 to maximize its actual profits, which look like this, so price minus cost times quantity, and we differentiate this with respect to P1. Then we rearrange the FOC to get our price as a function, price of P, our price of firm 1 as a function of the price of firm 2, so our best response function, and here we don't have any uncertainty because firm 1 knows its price, its marginal cost, and therefore there's no uncertainty here. However, firm 2 doesn't know C1. However, it knows that firm 1 behaves according to this function, given that firm 1 knows its own cost. So what firm 2 does is to form expectations about firm 1's reaction function based on its prior beliefs according to the marginal cost of firm 1. So what this means is that we basically again formulate a weighted average best response function that firm 2 expects firm 1 to have. So with probability y, we expect the low reaction function. With probability 1 minus y, we expect the high reaction function. What does high and low mean? Well, the low one would be the reaction function when C1 is equal to CH, right? And then we are here. If C1 is equal to CH, then we just substitute C1 equals CH, and then we are here. And again, we have to weigh this with the respective prior beliefs, which is y and 1 minus y. And when we reduce this expression, we get to this one here, right? And that basically means that firm 2 expects a reaction function of firm 1 that is just based on the expected marginal cost of firm 1, right? So according to what firm 2 believes firm 1 marginal costs to be, will determine where the expected reaction function will be. That doesn't work as intended. Okay, now, how do we proceed? Well, now we have determined what firm 2 expects firm 1 to do. Now let's look at firm 2's optimality condition. Well, firm 2 basically has a weighted average of its profit that it maximizes, and what we want to do is to maximize this profit, right? So what it will be is just price minus cost, there's no uncertainty involved here, times the quantity, and the quantity is a function of the expected price. So what we do is we differentiate this function with respect to P2, and then we substitute firm 1's best response function, or expected best response function, into this first order condition. And then we get to firm 2's best response function based on what it believes firm 1 will do. And this is this function here, right? And recall that we have determined this P1E on the previous slide. This was this one here. So what we basically do is to just substitute what we have just determined here, and then we can formulate firm 2's equilibrium price, right? And this equilibrium price is a function of, again, of the weighted average marginal cost. Okay, so that's just for the calculation. Now let's get back to the economic analysis, or the economics behind it. Well, this is the best response function for an exemplary calculation. Just look up the numbers here and just substitute them, and you will get to these results here. So first we have our best response function of firm 2. This is the dotted line here that almost looks horizontal, but it is slightly increasing. So you probably, hopefully see that on the screen. With respect to firm 1, we have 3 potential best response functions. The green and the red one are the actual best response functions that firm 1 has. And there's of course 2, because cost can either be low or high. And firm 1 knows whether it's high or low, and these are the respective best response functions here. The black one is the best response function that firm 2 believes firm 1 to have. So this is the actual best response function that determines the equilibrium with uncertainty, right? And the equilibrium price with uncertainty will be here, right? So the intersection point between what firm 2 believes to be firm 1's best response function, so the solid black line, and the dotted black line, which is firm 2's best response function, right? And now it's crucial to see that this corresponds to a price that is about here of firm 2. Now, it is crucial to know for our upcoming analysis that if there was no uncertainty, prices would be different, right? So what does this mean? Suppose firm 1 actually has low marginal cost and there would be no uncertainty. So in a sense, firm 2 would basically be aware of firm 1's marginal cost. And that would mean that this would be the intersection point, so the actual equilibrium, and the price that corresponds to this would be here. Right, so it doesn't look as clean because this function is not too strongly upward sloping, but still I hope that you get the idea. So the price that firm 2 charges when firm 1 actually has low marginal costs, and firm 2 knows this, is lower than with uncertainty. However, if firm 1 has high marginal costs, you guessed it, the equilibrium is here, and the price of firm 2 will be, well, it's not that drastic, but it's for illustrative reasons here, will be higher than with uncertainty. So summing up, if there was no uncertainty, then the price would be lower than with uncertainty if firm 1 has low marginal cost, and it will be higher if firm 1 has high marginal cost. That's important because we need that later. Okay, now let's talk about the information exchange. Here again, let us just introduce some notation. P2L and P2H would be firm 2's prices if firm 1's marginal cost would be low and high respectively, with full information. Now, this is just what we have been talking about. Suppose that with uncertainty our price of firm 2 is P2 asterisk, then if firm 1 has low marginal costs and there would be no uncertainty, the price with uncertainty, P2 asterisk, would be higher than the price without uncertainty, P2L. Vice versa, if firm 1 has high marginal cost, then without uncertainty the price would be P2H, and P2H would be higher than the price with uncertainty, P2 asterisk. Right? Now let us assume that the firms would be allowed to share information. If firm 1 has low marginal cost, then it would have no incentive to reveal its type in a credible way. Why? Because firm 1 benefits from firm 2 believing that firm 1 has high marginal costs. So it's better for firm 1 if firm 2 believes that marginal costs are high. Right? Why? Because the price would actually would decrease if firm 2 knew the true type of firm 1. That's detrimental to firm 1, as we know that prices are strategic complements. So the higher the price of firm 2, the better it is for firm 1. The situation is reversed when firm 1 actually has high marginal costs, because this would lead to, if firm 2 actually knew what the type of firm 1 would be, this would actually lead to an increase in prices, which is again good for firm 1, right? So we sum up that if firm 1 has a low type, then it has no incentive to reveal its type, and when it has a high type, it has an incentive to reveal its type. So now, we have to distinguish between two cases. if the information that we exchange are verifiable, then we will see that the information exchange can occur. Why is that? Well, suppose firm 1 is a low cost type. When it reveals its type, we know that prices will decrease. So there is no incentive to keep firm 2 informed, right? When firm 2 has high cost, when firm 1 has high marginal cost, firm 1 has an incentive to reveal its type, to tell firm 2, well, look, I have high cost. And the point here is that information are verifiable. So if firm 2 is told, look, I have high cost, then it can verify this information, for instance, through a trade association or anything, or a mediator, and it would know that the information that firm 1 has submitted or transmitted is actually true. And that, in that case, we have a situation where we can separate the two types. That's why it's called then a separating equilibrium, because if firm 2 is told, or if firm 1 tells firm 2, look, I'm a high type, firm 2 can verify this information, and if firm 2 does not reveal any information, firm 2 knows that it will be a low cost type because there are only two types, right? So firm 2 either receives an information or it does not. If it receives an information, it knows, okay, it's a high type. And if it does not receive an information, it knows that it will be a low type. So in that case, the information exchange might actually occur because it's basically beneficial, it's basically credible. Now, the effect of an information exchange is unclear because it might actually be the case that prices increase. We have just seen that, so it could be good or bad for consumers. Now, the other situation would be non-verifiable information. In that case, the things are a little bit more tricky. Again, firm 1 has no incentive to reveal its type when it has low marginal costs. Actually, it has an incentive to claim that it is a high cost type, because if firm 1 could make firm 2 believe it has high cost, then prices would be even higher than with uncertainty. So firm 2 would benefit, firm 1 would benefit even more, right? So what would firm 1 with a low type do? Well, it would actually tell firm 2, look, I'm a high type, even though it is actually a low type, because it has a benefit of firm 2 believing that firm 1 is a high type. Yes, exactly. When firm 1 has actually high cost, then it has an incentive to reveal its type truthfully, right? So what happens is that firm 1 always tells firm 2, look, I'm a high cost type. That's what we call a pooling equilibrium. So firm 2 cannot use this information to its advantage by any means, because it will always receive the same information and it cannot verify it. So it will not believe the information that it receives, right? In that case, any information exchange would not be credible, and it is disputable whether it would occur in the first place. If there's small costs involved, then the analysis gets a little bit more different, but it probably wouldn't occur. Okay, so what we have learned so far is how to formalize or formally analyze an information exchange, and what we can say is that first, the occurrence of an information exchange is not easy to determine per se, and second, we cannot actually say what the effect is. So we will have to have a case-by-case analysis here. Okay. Next, let us talk about research and development agreements. They are called research joint ventures, and it could range, it could involve different activities. It could be that two firms outsource the research activity to a joint lab, or it could even be that they cooperate directly or formulate, or something like that. The thing is that it also might affect future product markets, as by definition an R&D agreement is about R&D. So they could develop new products, and that would mean that future markets that don't exist today are actually affected. The problem is that it could lead to collusion, right? Because if we cooperate on R&D, then why shouldn't we talk about prices? That's a little supple. But it might also lead to a situation that actually slows down R&D activity, and that's what we're looking at in the next slides. So what do? We look at a model of a research joint venture, and we first look at a situation where we don't have a research joint venture, so no RJV. In the first stage, we have two firms, and these two firms choose their respective research activity, which is just a real valued number. The marginal cost of each firm is decreasing in this research activity. However, the crucial point here is that there is a spillover, and we measure the spillover by beta. So what does spillover mean? Look at this function here that determines our marginal cost. So the marginal costs of firm I are some constant minus I's own research activity xi minus beta times the research activity of the rival firm xj, right? And we see that if xj increases, then ci might decrease as well, right? And the larger beta is, the higher the spillover effects, that means that the higher the research activity of the rival translates into a reduction of your own marginal cost. And if beta is 1, it's a situation where it doesn't really matter whether you do research or your rival does research, right? And that creates a free riding problem. So the higher beta, the more firm I can free ride on the research activity of firm J. And that creates an incentive problem here in terms of investment. Okay, so we define the research costs or the R&D costs to be a quadratic term, so it's basically xi squared. In the second stage, we assume that firms compete in quantities, so we have Cournot competition, and we assume a demand function Q is A minus P, so simple setup. How do we solve that? Well, we use backwards induction, so we look at stage 2 first. How does stage 2 look like? Well, it's standard Cournot. So I would advise you to look at chapter B, where we talk about Cournot competition, and the results are outlined there in general. So you just have to use these techniques. So what you first do is to set up your profit function, which is P minus Ci times the quantity, and the quantity is like this, and the quantity we have to formulate it in the sense that we have our inverse demand function, so A minus Q, where we need to have here A minus Qi minus Qj, and this is our price, and then we have minus Ci here, we multiply by Qi, and we shouldn't forget our research cost, which is this one here. And if we differentiate this one with respect to Qi, and we do the same for firm J, we have an asymmetric Cournot that leads to this expression here. And here we have already noted that Ci and Cj are a function of xi and xj, so we basically take into account this function here, right? So if you want to determine that explicitly, you just substitute Ci and Cj here according to these functions, and then you get your equilibrium output levels. Okay, so if we do that, then we can determine our equilibrium profits as well. So just using this expression and determining prices and then determining indirect profits, then we are left at this expression here. And here we again have Ci and Cj as functions of xi and xj. Okay, so with this standard solution, we can look explicitly at the optimality condition of stage 1. So what we do is to substitute Ci and Cj according to this function here into this expression, and we will end up with this expression here. And what this basically means is that we have a function that now depends only on xi and xj. So we can differentiate this function with respect to xi, and then we get our best response function from the first order condition. So differentiate with respect to xi, set equal to 0, rearrange with respect to xi, and then you get to this expression. What this expression tells you is basically what will firm I's research activity be given a certain research activity of firm J, right? So our classical best response function. And if we look at this in detail, we will see that we have two situations here. So the best response function will be increasing in the rival's research activity if beta exceeds 0.5. In that case, we would have strategic complements, right? If we are in the other situation, if beta is lower than 0.5, we are in case of strategic substitutes. So what does it mean? Well, we have talked about strategic complements in the context of Bertrand. So the higher your price, the higher the rival's price should be. And in case of strategic substitutes, we're in Canot, the more the output of your rival, the less your output will be, right? So that's basically what we have here. And 0.5 determines the turning point here, when it becomes strategic, when xi becomes strategic complements. Okay, so what you can do next is to just assume symmetry at that point. So just assume that this xj is an xi, and then you get to this expression if you just simplify, right? And this is our equilibrium research activity without a research joint venture. And what you see here is that if you differentiate this function, so the equilibrium research activity of one firm, with respect to beta, you will see that the function is decreasing if beta is between 0 and 1, which is true by definition. So that means that the higher the spillover parameter, the lower the research activity will be in equilibrium, and that is due to free riding behavior, right? So, and what we do now is to install a research joint venture. Why do we do that? Well, economically speaking, we have this positive externality, which is our research activity, and we want to internalize this positive externality. And how do we do that? Well, we pack the two firms together, right? And that means that we have the two firms not competing on the research level, but still competing on the product market. That means that the profit function on stage 2, so this one here, is the same as before because the firms compete on the first stage, but our objective function on the R&D level is the sum of the two profits, right? And no longer unilateral profit maximization. So what we do is to take firm I and firm J's profit and add it up. And then we are at this term here, basically. So by the same token that we have determined this one here, we have to do the same for firm J, and then we add these two functions up, and then we are here. Okay, so what we do here is to maximize this function with respect to xi and xj, so basically formulate two first order conditions. At that point we could also assume symmetry and make the life easier for us, and eventually we get to this equilibrium research activity level, which looks like this, right? So that's the term for our equilibrium research activity with a research joint venture. And now how can we assess the effect of the research joint venture? Well, what we have to do is to determine our equilibrium R&D investment without a research joint venture with the equilibrium investments with a research joint venture. So our comparative static analysis as we are used to. And what we see is basically that the effect is ambiguous. I will show you on the next slide what it actually means. So what we have against the background of economic mechanisms is that we have two effects. First of all, the research joint venture internalizes the spillover, so the positive externality, and that reduces the incentives for free riding and increases research activity in equilibrium. That lifts X up. On the other hand, we take out some competition from the firms, which means that the pressure to innovate is lowered to some extent. Not perfectly, but it is lowered. And therefore, we have a detrimental effect to our X in equilibrium. Now, we have now plotted it here for an example where A minus C is normalized to 1, and we have the dashed line here, that's the equilibrium research activity without a joint venture, and we have the solid line, which is the research activity with a joint venture. And you see here that the intersection point is exactly 0.5, and if we are below 0.5 in our example here, we have higher research activity without a research joint venture. And if we are above 0.5, we are in a situation where the research joint venture increases research activity. So what we could argue is that when we are left of 0.5, the spillover effect that we internalize is not so strong that it would overcompensate the competitive edge that the firms get over one another. Whereas if we move to the right, then we have this spillover effect is so strong that it makes sense to put them together if we want more research. Now, what we have assumed in the previous slides was that beta is exogenously given. If we talk about research joint ventures, this assumption might not be too reasonable because it might depend on the firm's conduct. And this conduct might change in an RJV. So what does it mean? Well, for instance, if you do research in an RJV, you probably disclose the results of the research, and you probably do so much more severe or thoroughly than you would do outside a research joint venture. So what we assume here is that beta is endogenous in the sense that if we are in a research joint venture, beta is increased to 1. Right? And if we do that, just substitute the number in our examples that we have before, our research activity in equilibrium with a research joint venture will be 0.4 times A minus C, and we can determine marginal cost in that case. We could determine output, which is this one, and then we can also determine the prices, right? And what you see here is that the market price without a research joint venture, where beta is below 1, is higher compared to a research joint venture when we could move beta equal to 1. So in that case, the research joint venture would definitely be profitable. But again, probably this doesn't work. So probably there's adaptability problems between the two firms' technologies, so that this probably wouldn't hold. But again, it depends on the market that we're in, right? So in that case, if prices even decrease with a research joint venture, the research joint venture is definitely good for consumers. Now, before we get to buyer or purchasing agreements, let us talk more broadly about the remaining alternatives. So we have production specialization agreements. So that could be horizontal or vertical, and what you basically do is to have one firm producing one specific product and specializing in it, and the other firm specializes in the product of the other firm. That could lead to cost savings overall, but it also might might facilitate collusion or foreclosure. So if, for instance, these two firms are not willing to sell to their rivals, then we could have foreclosure effects. If they decide not to only compete on this production level, they could also compete on the price level, collude on the price level, so that would be detrimental. We could have purchasing agreements. What this basically means is that that the firms, the buyers, form a union, a buyer union, and they just buy jointly, not separately. That could increase their bargaining position, and therefore they could realize lower wholesale prices. And that could be beneficial to consumers. However, again, it might facilitate collusion or create foreclosure aspects. Commercialization and joint marketing agreements, there we just do the marketing for a product jointly, and again we might have collusion here or foreclosure. Lastly, there's agreements on standards. So if you want all firms to use a unified USB protocol, then you establish a standard for this for the existing and future product. And this could be problematic for competition if it reduces competition in future markets, right? All of this basically depends on the case. And what we're doing next is to analyze purchasing agreements and buyer power in more detail. So what do the firms do here exactly? Well, if you look at grocery retailing, if you are a simple grocery retailing shop or store, and you bargain with the large producers of brand products, then it's you're probably not in the most favorable bargaining position, because if the producer might easily not serve your market but serve your rival's market, which is probably 500 meters away, and all the consumers will buy the products there. However, if you buy jointly with all retailers in the market, then you could realize buyer power, right? Then it probably means that if you don't find agreement with the manufacturer, then the manufacturer will not sell the products in the entire country, for instance, if there's all retailers in a country being involved in a single purchasing agreement. That's just to give you an idea. In reality, it could manifest in different ways. It could be listing fees, slotting allowances, advertising grants, or exclusivity clauses. All of that are basically forms of these purchasing agreements and buyer power. And what we are looking at will be slotting allowances in detail. It could also be related to listing fees, where basically what happens is that a retailer demands a payment from the manufacturer just to list the products or to offer the products of the manufacturers. Now, before we jump into a concrete model here, what we do is to first look at purchasing agreements from a more general perspective. So we look at the classic textbook of Varian, 1981, and what we assume is that we have monopolistic buyers before, and then they basically become one monopsonistic buyer. We know monopoly, which basically means that you have market power on the sales side. And in monopsony, it's a little bit reversed. You have buyer power on all perfect buyer power in terms of your buying side, right? It will become clear if we look at this in detail. So, what we have is a market with a homogeneous good, and it is sold by multiple price-taking downstream firms. They purchase the intermediate product at a wholesale price W from upstream firms, and they sell the goods to final customers at retail price P. Demand is again A minus P. And the upstream firms, where the downstream firms, the retailers, actually buy their products from, they are also price takers. The cost function upstream is quadratic. Now, we start with the first case where we don't have buyer power. On the downstream level, well, backwards induction, so we start at the latest stage, we have price equal marginal cost. What is marginal cost? Marginal cost in our sample for the downstream firms is the wholesale price. Because if you as a retailer want to sell another product, you have to buy it from the upstream producer, and the upstream producer charges wholesale price W, so the price that you sell the product to your customers is the same as the price that you buy the product from the upstream firm. Now, if we look at the upstream firm, then we can just assume they are, again, price takers. If they are price takers, then this is the maximization problem here. So they sell at a given wholesale price W. They sell a quantity Q, so this is the revenue here. And this is the cost function, which is quadratic, so this would be revenue, this would be cost, And if you differentiate this function with respect to q and rearrange the first order condition, then you get to w is 2 minus q. Now, we know that that in equilibrium p is equal to w. We have determined that w is equal to 2q, so we know based on our demand function that p is a minus q, and now we can say that a minus q is equal to p is equal to w is equal to 2 minus q, so a minus q is equal to 2 minus q in equilibrium. That means that our equilibrium output will be a over 3. Okay. Now let's consider a situation where the downstream firms establish a purchasing agreement and become a monopsonistic buyer. On the upstream level, nothing changes. So the same maximization problem applies, so that the wholesale price will be equal to 2q. What the downstream firms now do, they maximize their profits, so each downstream firm maximizes its profits, which is a given retail price. So note that the firms do not behave monopolistically on the retail market. They behave monopsonistically when buying from the upstream firms. So the price is still an exogenous parameter here. So price times quantity is our revenue downstream, and the wholesale price times the quantity is our cost, right? And here the thing is that as the downstream firms behave as monopsonists, the downstream firms know that this relation exists and that this relation can be influenced by their behavior, right? It's similar to when we assume that there's a monopolist, and the monopolist just not takes the price as given, but he takes the price function as given. So basically the demand function or the inverse demand function. And here the same thing happens, right? So the monopsonist takes into account the marginal cost function, which is here the function that determines the wholesale price, so 2 times q. Now the cost is the wholesale price as a function of q times q, and then we are at 2q squared. And if we differentiate this function with respect to q, we immediately get to the result that our price is equal to q over 4, basically by determining q, and then q will be a over 5, and from there we can determine the price here. Now, what we see is that in monopsony, the quantity that the downstream firms purchase and sell, of course, is lower than without monopsony. So with monopsony, we have a over 5. Without monopsony, we had a over 3. That means that monopsony would be bad because it decreases the quantity, which means that it increases prices, right? The downstream firms now realize profits, which is clear because they charge basically a premium on their marginal cost. So what we would say here is that buyer power reduces welfare. However, there are caveats here. First of all, and that's a crucial one, the entire result is driven by the marginal cost being increasing. So we have assumed a quadratic cost function, q squared. If we assume constant marginal cost, then the entire result disappears. And we also assume that we have price-taking behavior upstream. That's probably also not too realistic. So what we do is to move away from the standard example and move towards a world where we have a so-called bilateral monopoly, which is like, if you look at the I/O literature over the past years, and also the bargaining literature, they are closely related in that respect, that's hugely important. So what basically happens is that we have upstream now marginal costs that are constant, so we alleviate the problem that we had before. And we have downstream and upstream 2 monopolists. In that situation, we cannot use the prior solution because it will not determine our equilibrium. what we have to do is to think about the economics behind the world a little bit more in detail. So what we have here, or what we assume to be the case, is that the upstream and the downstream firms sit together and they think, well, what would be ideal for us, right? It would be ideal for us if we could charge together the monopoly price A/2. In that case, we would, as upstream and downstream firms, so if you look at it with a little sketch, then it would look something like this. So upstream firm, downstream firm, customer. So with the downstream firm charging the monopoly price, this coalition here would realize the monopoly profits, which is by definition, if we have a linear price though, this would be the maximum attainable profit. And if we have this to be the maximum attainable profit, then the thing that we have here is how do we determine which of the two parties become what fraction of this monopoly profits. So what they basically do is they bargain over one indivisible unit. So the upstream tells the downstream firm, look, I sell you the monopoly output at a given price, and this price now, as it is one quantity of output, namely the monopoly quantity, at a fixed price of T, and we call this price here then a fixed fee, or a fee in that case, as it's only one quantity. We could also call it a price. And that's the fixed fee that is charged by the upstream firm from the downstream firm for selling the downstream firm this monopoly quantity. Now, if we look at this from a so-called bargaining perspective in economic terms, then we would also have to look at the so-called disagreement profits. So the two firms sit together and they bargain, look, I sell you the monopoly quantity and you pay me price T, and we just determine what the price T will be. And the price T does not affect the profit in the market, it affects how the profit is allocated between you and D. And if the two firms do not come to agreement, then the two firms realize their disagreement profits, or outside options. Their disagreement profits from an upstream perspective are C, so the marginal costs. This basically means that I don't produce the product, or I produce the product and sell it to an outside market. Again, recall that C is, in an economic perspective, the opportunity cost. So that's what I would realize if I didn't sell to D. The downstream profits are zero because it doesn't receive anything to sell, right? And now if we look at the equilibrium tariff, then this equilibrium tariff will be in that interval. So if the equilibrium tariff would be below C, then the upstream firm would be better off breaking up negotiations as it would sell below marginal cost, basically, or opportunity cost. By the same token, if the price exceeds monopoly profits, then the downstream firm will break up negotiations, because even if it earned the entire market profits, monopoly profits, it couldn't pay the upstream firm for it, right? So it's better up breaking up the negotiations to avoid losses. Now, this is basically the interval the equilibrium price will be in. Where we will be exactly in this interval is a subject to bargaining theory, right? So I will not dig into more detail here, even though it's very interesting, and we could, for instance, use the asymmetric Nash bargaining solution here that was established originally by Nash, but then later a little bit developed further with bargaining weights, and then we could determine where inside this interval we would be. But again, this would be beyond the scope of this lecture. Now, what we do lastly is to look at the model of Shaffer, 1991 in Rand, where we talk about slotting allowances. So one of these things where buyer power matters. So this basically the component where we go slightly away from our horizontal agreements towards vertical agreement, although it's not a vertical agreement per se, but it affects like this upstream downstream problematic, and it is related to basically buyer power on a downstream level. So it's something in between, which is of course worth noting. And before we start with the analysis, please note that the Shaffer model, it's published in RAND, so it's a very, very sophisticated model. What we do here is just, we just look at the surface of the model. We don't dig into too much detail here. Okay, so how does the model look like? On the upstream stage, we have perfect competition with price-taking firms, and we have constant marginal costs, C. On the retail level, we have two downstream retailers selling the products to the final consumers without further costs. And the consumers perceive the two retailers as differentiated variants, basically, or as differentiated retailers. For instance, that could be due to different locations. Now, the demand function for each retailer I looks like this. So it's similar to what we have looked at before, even though we save one parameter by just assuming that the demand of variant I increases in pi with a factor of a plus gamma and over 2, of course, and it decreases in pi by a factor 1 plus gamma over 2, and it increases in the price of the other variant, or in the price that the other retailer charges by a factor gamma over 2. So basically similar setup as before with B and D now, but only with one parameter here. And we can see that if gamma is equal to 0, this one disappears, then each one is a monopolist. If gamma approaches infinity, we basically have two perfectly interchangeable retailers. Now, our timing looks as follows. On stage 1, the producers set their wholesale prices, and they determine a two-part tariff, WI-TI, for each retailer. What is a two-part tariff? Well, WI is our wholesale price, which is per unit, and our TI is a fixed fee, right? So they determine a fixed component and a variable component. The fixed component is not dependent on output, but the variable component is. Now, each retailer chooses the producer from whom to buy from. And on the third stage, the retailers compete. So that's how the setup looks like. Now, the first thing that we're looking at is a case where the fixed fee is basically bound to be 0, right? So setup without a fixed fee. What we do is to apply backwards induction and look at the third stage first. So we look at the stage where the retailers compete. How do the retailers compete? Well, each retailer sets its retail price, Pi, to maximize its profits, Pi. And how does the profit look like? Well, it's price minus marginal costs. Marginal cost is the wholesale price times the output. So that's Qi, right? So pretty straightforward. And we formulate the first order condition, and then we can apply symmetry, which makes the analysis, at that point we didn't, because we can make it even easier. So what we do is to differentiate this function with respect to Pi, set the resulting function equal to 0, and rearrange with respect to Pi. And then we are here. And what we then do is to really assume symmetry. I was confused, sorry. To assume symmetry, which means that Pi and Pj are the same. And then we can just rearrange the function to get an implicit equilibrium retail price, which only depends on the marginal cost. So the two different wholesale prices, Wi and Wj, right? So you can do that as a practice. Again, you just have to differentiate the function. You could do the same for the other firm. You would have two first order conditions that you can solve, right? Because it's two functions with two unknowns. Now, going back moving upwards to the second and the first stage, how does retailer 1 organize its buying? Well, retailer 1, or I, buys from the producer that gives him the higher profits, the highest profits. So what does retailer I do? Well, it maximizes with respect to WI, so it searches for the cheapest contract here, so the maximum, it maximizes its profits over the wholesale price, so it will basically be interested in the lowest wholesale price here, and it realizes that the price is a function of Wi and Wj in equilibrium, anticipating the third stage, so this is the price, minus the wholesale price, so again this thing here, times the quantity, and the quantity is a function of I's price and J's price, right? So you could substitute these two prices into the demand function, which is basically this one, so substitute here, and Pj as a function of Wi and Wj, you substitute for this, and then you end up with this quantity basically. Now, we have written this down in implicit function form to make it a little bit more observable in the end, because the solution here is pretty straightforward. So, here it's basically just the profit of firm I, and of course firm I wants to maximize this profits. The interesting thing now happens in the constraint here. So the constraint is basically that the profit upstream is 0. Why is that? The upstream firms are in perfect competition. So in equilibrium, they will not make profits. So what we do is we basically anticipate the equilibrium condition and have it as a constraint included here. So this is, as you might have realized, the upstream profits. So the upstream profits of selling to firm I is the wholesale price that is charged to firm I, and minus the marginal costs of production, which are symmetric, times the quantity, right? And this has to be 0. So we could set up the Lagrangian now and do the entire calculus, but we don't have to, because we just have to look at this constraint here, right? We only have one instrument, and that's Wi. So how can we satisfy this constraint by choosing Wi? Well, we could choose Wi such that Qi would be 0. That's not very productive, as this would mean that there's no market, because nothing is sold or produced. So that's probably not the equilibrium that we're searching for. The other thing that we could influence would be this one. So when would this one be 0? Well, this would be 0 if Wi is equal to C. So if Wi is equal to C, this term is 0, and 0 times any quantity will be 0, right? So what we will have in equilibrium, and that's a huge surprise, will be wholesale price is equal to marginal cost. And that's not very surprising, as in perfect competition we know that price equals marginal cost. And what is the price upstream? The price upstream is the wholesale price. So, anticipating that the wholesale price will be equal to marginal costs, we can substitute here C, simplify the function, and we will arrive at this point here. And that's retailer I's price in equilibrium. Okay. Now that we have analyzed the case without fixed fee, so basically a linear tariff, we now go to an example of a two-part tariff. What does this mean? Well, we also have the fixed component that is not necessarily fixed to 0. We're now first taking a little less intuitive view by looking at the implicit functions. This has the benefit that we can analyze the economics behind it in a clearer way, right? Even though it will be mathematically a little bit more tractable, a little bit less tractable than just computing the equilibrium values. However, you could also do that, and I will show you the results in a minute. Okay, so what we have here is the downstream profit maximization. Is the downstream profit maximization. And how does it look like? Well, price minus wholesale price times quantity. Quantity is a function of your own price and the rival's price. You differentiate with respect to PI, and you then end up with this expression here. This expression is basically like in monopoly, there's a price effect and a quantity effect, or in oligopoly, price and a quantity effect, and you just take this into account when maximizing, right? So what you do is to just have an implicit derivative here, del Qi, del Pi, and what you do next, which is something that you wouldn't do if you didn't know where to use it for. So note that it is like that, and it's okay if you don't understand it now. We will use that later, right? So what you just do is to bring Wi times del Qi del Pi to the other side, which we will use later, right? So keep that in mind, we will use that. But for now, we're continuing with our equilibrium price, which is the same as before because it hasn't changed, right? So if we calculate the explicit solution, then it looks like this, right? Okay, now we move up to the first and the second stage of the game. So what does retailer I do? Well, it buys from the producer that offers him the most attractive terms. What does this mean? Well, it looks almost similar as it did before. So each retailer maximizes its profits, now not only with respect to the wholesale price Wi, but also with respect to the fixed fee Ti. And the profits look a little bit different because the retailer's profits are again a function of the retail price Pi minus wholesale price Wi times quantity, which is a function of Pi and Pj, and Pi and Pj are in equilibrium functions of Wi and Wj. That's important, and it will be like that's why it's a little bit confusing. And here we have the fixed fee, because the retailer knows that in addition to paying a wholesale price, it has to pay a fixed fee. Now, on the upstream level, the things look almost the same as before. So again, the wholesale price is the selling price of the upstream firms. Marginal cost of production are C. The output that you produce is a function of Pi and Pj. Pi and Pj are functions of Wi and Wj in equilibrium. And the upstream firm receives a fixed payment of Ti here, right? And again, we anticipate our equilibrium. So in the constraint here, we assume that the profits the upstream firm receives will be 0. Okay. Now, what we do to analyze this will be to set up a Lagrangian function that looks like this. So it's pretty similar. You formulate the objective function, which is the first part. So here, objective, then plus the shadow price times the constraint here. So this is the constraint, this is the shadow price, the lambda. Now, what you do when looking at this, the first step would be to differentiate with respect to Ti. Why is that? Well, it simplifies the analysis. If you differentiate with respect to Ti, you will see that we have -1 plus lambda, and in equilibrium this term has to be 0, so lambda will be equal to 1. So we can also already anticipate that lambda is equal to 1. Now the next step we have to take is to differentiate this Lagrangian here with respect to Wi. And what you do is to go all terms where Wi is an argument, which is these terms here, differentiate them, take into account the respective rules, product rule and so on, and then set the resulting function equal to 0. And then you arrive at the first order condition. And this first order condition can be reduced to this term, right? So this is something that it doesn't make sense to do it here. If you participate in our classes, our physical classes, or if you participate in our VIP program, which is offered by JLU in summer term 2023, for instance, then you will have an exercise class where you go through this in detail. At this point, just realize you can formulate this FOC and it will reduce to that point, and just use it as a practice to come up with this solution here. Now, given that this is the FOC, what do we do next? What do we do about this? Well, the thing is it's pretty fancy. So what we then do is to use the expression 5, where I told you that you wouldn't expect or you wouldn't do that if you didn't know where to go. But now we know that we need it, so we basically substitute this part here with this function. So we know that Q times Pi del Qi del Pi is also here, right? And we know that it is this term, right? So what we do is to factor out Pi times del Qi del Pi and substitute Wi times del Qi del Pi for it, right? So we substitute 5 into 6 to get to this term here. Now, how does this term help us? And now we get to, we first go through a mathematical proof, and then we get the economics behind it, right? So we combine these two concepts to learn something from this expression here, because this expression at first glance, it doesn't really look good to us. Before we analyze this one, it makes sense to get some intuition on the signs of the respective terms. So we know that Wi and Ci, these terms here, it could be positive or negative. Basically everything is possible. Here also Pi and C, even though we have to take into account that once the price is below the marginal costs, or the retail price is below the marginal costs, or the retail price is below the wholesale price, then this party makes losses for which it has to be compensated. So that's something we just have to take into account. However, the remaining terms here, del Qi del Pi is the partial derivative of the demand function of variant I with respect to its own price. And we know that the slope of this term is negative. The derivative del Pi del Wi is the partial derivative of the price of variant I with respect to the wholesale price I. And here we have exactly what we have to differentiate with respect to Wi. So we see here that this term is increasing in Wi. Why is that? Well, economically speaking, if you're charged a higher wholesale price, ceteris paribus, your retail price will increase. So this term here will be positive. And we know that a negative term times a positive term is negative. That's why we know that this term here, so this will be negative. Now, look at this later term here. So the first part is the derivative of the demand for variant I with respect to the price of variant J, right? I have marked this orange here to highlight this. So what happens is that this slope here is positive, because if variant J gets more expensive, then the demand for variant I will increase, or for retail I, to be precise. So this one here has a positive slope. Then we look at the rival or firm J's price and how this changes in firm I's wholesale price. So the partial derivative of Pj with respect to Wi. So what we do is to look at this term here, basically noting that the signs will change. So it will not be I but J, which means that this is a J and this is an I, basically. So that's what happens. And we see here that Pj increases in Wi, right? So the partial derivative of the price of retailer J with respect to the wholesale price of firm I will be positive, right? So these two terms here are positive, which means that the factor of the two, the product of the two will also be positive. Right. So now that we have that out of the way, we can get to our proof part here. And what we want to show is that the wholesale price exceeds marginal costs in equilibrium, and the tariff is negative. So that's what we will show, and we will basically do that by contradiction. So let us first assume that Wi is equal to C, right? So if Wi is equal to C, then we have 0 here. If we have 0 here, then this term will drop out, it will be 0. If 7 is to be satisfied, then this one would have to be 0 as well. However, as long as Pi exceeds C, this term will be positive after all, because this would only be 0 if this one here is 0, and this one would only be 0 if Pi is equal to C. That would mean that the retailer would sell at marginal production costs upstream. Well, why should it do so, right? So we haven't constrained that. There's no reason that if you are sold the product at a price equal to marginal cost, which basically means Wi is equal to C. So you are sold the product for a price equals marginal cost. So why should the retailer set a price of marginal cost as well? There's no need to. This term will be greater than 0 if Wi is equal to 0. So 7 will not be satisfied. Okay, so if Wi cannot be equal to C, then probably it could be smaller than C. If Wi would be smaller than C, then this term here would be negative. And a negative term times a negative term would be positive. So this term here would be positive. And if 7 has to hold in equilibrium, and this one here is positive, then this one here has to be negative. How can that be? Well, this one is positive. So if this would have to hold, then this would need to be negative. That means that the retailer sells the product below marginal costs. That, however, would only be possible if the tariff would be negative. Because if you sell below marginal cost, then you have to be compensated for that, basically. In other words, you wouldn't accept that, basically. Because otherwise the retailer would incur losses, and we would also have losses upstream, right? So we sell below marginal costs, which means that the profit along the entire value chain is negative. So it is impossible to compensate for these losses along the value chain, as we basically sell the product from the viewpoint of our upstream-downstream combination below marginal cost. So there will be no positive profits. So that cannot be the equilibrium as well, right? So if we know that Wi cannot be equal to C, and Wi cannot be smaller than C, then we know that Wi must exceed C, right? And now, if we take that a step further, if Wi is larger than C, then we know from our upstream profits, that is Wi minus C times Qi plus Ti. This is the upstream profits of the firm that supplies from I. And if we know that this term here is positive, and the quantity is positive as well, then we know that upstream, on this term at least, there's upstream profits. But in equilibrium, we need to have upstream profits equal to 0 because we have perfect competition. So if this term here is positive in equilibrium, then this term needs to be negative. So what this means is that in equilibrium, we will have a contract that the wholesale price exceeds marginal cost. So on the operative level, you could say there's profits. However, the upstream profits are completely reduced by a negative fixed fee, which basically means that the upstream firm pays a transfer to the downstream firm. And that's our slotting allowances story, because the retailer, even though the contract is designed in a way that the producer sets a fixed fee and per unit price, will pay something downstream just to make sale, right? And that's the idea of slotting allowances, or listing fees could also be interpreted in a similar way. So you pay something in order to get into the shelves of a retailer, right? And that's the idea here. Before we get into that in more detail, I will just present you the computation here just briefly. So you could, of course, I mean, all the things we have done here so far with the implicit functions, we could also do, of course, with the exact functions that we have given, right? And what you do, or how you can do that, is to substitute. Just take a look at our Lagrangian here. Just substitute pi here, and also here in the demand function you substitute pi, which is this one, and then you get an expression that only depends on wi and ti, and then you can just use the Lagrangian technique to come up with a solution. If you do that, then the first thing would still be to differentiate the Lagrangian function with respect to t. Then you know that lambda is equal to 1, and if you know that, then you differentiate with respect to w1, and the first order condition would look something like this if we note that lambda is equal to 1. It looks a little bit, it's tedious to derive that solution, keep that in mind. However, you have here the solutions, and if you are at that point, life gets a little easier, because then you can assume symmetry. Just W1 and W2 and W1 will be the same. And if you know that, then you can just, well, sorry, I have here W1 and W2, and here I have Wi and Wj, so just use for this one here, use an I, and for this one, use a J. So that would be the correct notation, however, that's not too important. In any case, use symmetry here. So use for Wi and Wj, or W1 and W2, the same expression, and then you reduce and rearrange, then you get to this equilibrium wholesale price. If you have the equilibrium wholesale price, then according to this function, we can determine our equilibrium retail price, which is this one. If we have the retail price, we can substitute the retail prices into our demand functions. Then we get these as our demand functions. And then from the zero profit conditions upstream, noting that we have the quantity and the wholesale price, we can determine our two-part tariff, and we see here as well that the two-part tariff is negative. So that's the thing that we have theoretically shown with the implicit functions as well. Okay, so if you want to practice that, just do this entire calculations. You have the solutions here, so you know where you should end up with, and it's a good practice. Now, coming back to the economics behind it and summing up the results. So what we see is that if we introduce two-part tariffs here, which we would interpret something like a relic of, or a consequence of buyer power, right? Because if you don't have buyer power, it's probably unlikely that you can introduce a tariff or something like a tariff structure like that. What we have, if we do that, is that we have higher wholesale prices, and this is offset by fixed fees. So there will be profits upstream, but the downstream retailers will extract these profits via fixed fees, right? And the retail prices will in the end increase. That's something we haven't shown here. Just look at Proposition 8 in Shaffer paper if you want to know that. It's too technical to tackle it here. Okay, so that's it for the lecture on H2. Again, this is the last part was very technical. I know that, and it's among the most technical things that we do in this lecture. However, I hope that I haven't lost all of you. Again, noting that it's the most complicated thing. It's not so bad that if you didn't understand it at first glance. Right? Again, I told you there could be the option of participating in our virtual intellectual program, to have an exercise class where you get into that in more detail. Anyway, I hope that you liked the video, I hope that you learned something, and I would like to thank you for your attention. If you liked the video, of course, we would be very happy if you liked it. So thumbs up. and if you consider subscribing to our channel and leaving some comments, we would also be very happy about that. Okay, that's it. See you in the next one.